Hello everyone, my name is Gopal Krishnan from CKF and welcome to Java Jumpstart. Today we'll begin over switch statements. Let's see what I'm going to cover over today. First, I'm going to give you a brief introduction on switch statements. Second, I'm going to talk about each individual parts in a switch statement. Third, I'm going to combine all those parts together and explain as a whole. And finally, I'm going to compare switch statements with other parts of Java and other codes. Introduction. What are switch statements? Switch statements are similar to if or else statements. If you haven't learned about if or else statements yet, please check out our previous video on it. Switch statements, like if or else statements, compares one variable to other statements. It's able to change, print, and return values. So essentially, if we have a variable, we'll be able to alter it. We can only compare one variable in a switch statement, meaning if we select one variable, we cannot add any other variable. We can also do nest switch statements. I'll explain more about it later. The specifics. Switch statements can only support int, char, byte, short string, and enum. Essentially, our variable can only be these values. Enum is a class where we could create an object that acts similar to primitive structures. One cool thing about switch statements is that it's similar features as C, C++, and JavaScript. Here's how essentially a nest switch looks like. First, we have case A and case B. If the variable evaluates to A or B, it will print out good job. I'll explain more about how this works later. Individual parts. We have switch, case, and break. Switch is where we put in the variable we want to compare. This is in the first line of the code, and we have to add the curly braces here. And the rest of the code goes into the curly braces. Case. Case is where we compare the variable with. We could place any variable or individual value. If it evaluates to true, the code will run inside the case. If false, it will move on to the next case. Break. Break is not just a switch statement concept. It's in all over Java. Essentially, if a break statement is reached, the code will stop. Switch statement. Here's where you place the variable you want to compare. The rest of the statements will check if it equals the variable in switch. So we add switch first and the variable inside the brackets. And inside the curly brackets, we add the case and the breaks. This variable represents the value that we want to switch. We can only have one variable. If you try to add more variables, that means the code will occur in a syntax error. Case. Case is where we switch the variable and evaluate it. If it evaluates to true, the rest of the code under it will run. So, if choice is equal to the variable that we want, system.out.println will occur. And with the break, the rest of the code won't happen. Break. Break is used in many parts of coding. Here in switch statements is used after the code in a case. So, if case occurs with choice and it prints out an empty value, we use break so it doesn't check the other cases. This is because after we check if the value is equal, we don't want the rest of the code to run. So we break out of the code. Here's why I didn't explain default in the earlier three parts. Default is not a necessary part in a switch statement. Consider it as an else in an if statement. If all the cases evaluate to false, then default will occur. Keep in mind that there has to be at least one case in the switch statement in order to use default. So essentially, if rest of the cases evaluate to false, then default will evaluate to true, and will print out this value. Overall structure. Here in overall structure, first we initialize the variable, then we do switch and the variable that we want to compare with, and the rest of the code will go into the curly braces. We do our each individual cases. We could have any number of cases that we want. And after we check each value, make sure to use break. So after we check, we could break out of the code. If we want to do a nest case, meaning that if we want two values to evaluate the same number or same statements, we could do this. So for example, if fruit equals mango or cherry, then system.out.println best fruit will happen. So we do case and another case. We can add as many cases as we want. In the end, all these values evaluate to false, then default will occur and print out unknown fruit. Comparisons. Switch statements deals with only one variable, which makes it very memory efficient. Since it uses switch and case, which contains less bytes in memory, it will have less memory cases than if statements. Here are some exceptions in switch statements. Sometimes we don't need to add break. This is the case when there's a return statement where it automatically breaks out of the code, or we don't want the case to stop and check over all the remaining cases. Aesthetics. One important part of coding is to make our code easily readable. So if we have a switch statement, we can easily tell which variable we want to switch with. Other code. The one cool thing about switch statements is that it follows the same format for most other codes, such as C, C++, and JavaScript. This is because in other codes there's also a switch, case, and default. The only thing that changes is the actual variable itself. Thank you for listening to today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.